The morning light filtered softly through the linen curtains, casting a gentle glow over the modest yet cozy apartment Hannah had carefully curated over the years. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as she returned home from her early jog, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. She expected nothing unusual, a typical Tuesday filled with client meetings and architectural drafts waiting at her firm. But as she approached the kitchen counter, her eyes fell upon a small, crumpled piece of paper hastily left beside her favorite mug. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, careless, and disturbingly familiar. She unfolded it, her fingers steady, her heart oddly calm. The message was simple, cruel, and laced with arrogance. "I've left you, Hannah. Took all the money from our joint account. Good luck surviving without me. Ryan." No explanations, no apologies, just cold, deliberate abandonment. Hannah stood there for a moment, the words searing into her mind. There was no dramatic gasp, no tears welling up. Instead, there was an eerie silence within her, as if her emotions had paused to process the absurdity of it all. She slowly poured herself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in gentle swirls, and sat at the kitchen table, reading the note again. The audacity of Ryan's words struck her, not just the betrayal, but the smugness, the assumption that she would crumble without him. She thought about their years together, the slow unraveling of their marriage masked by forced smiles and hollow conversations. The signs had been there all along, hidden beneath late nights at the office, unexplained absences, and dismissive remarks about her career. But nothing prepared her for this moment, not because she didn't expect it, but because she never imagined it would be so petty. She placed the note back on the counter, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't disbelief she felt, it was clarity. A strange sense of liberation washed over her, not the dramatic heartbreak often portrayed in movies, but a quiet, resolute understanding. Ryan thought he'd won some twisted game, leaving her destitute and desperate. But what he didn't know, what his inflated ego had blinded him to, was that Hannah was far from helpless. She sipped her coffee, savoring the bitterness, and whispered softly to herself, "Thanks for the head start." The gears in her mind were already turning, not fueled by revenge but by something far more powerful, self-respect. The hours following Ryan's cruel farewell passed in an unusual calm. Hannah methodically tidied the apartment, folding blankets, washing the lone coffee cup, and watering the potted plants perched on the windowsill. There was a strange comfort in the routine, an anchor in the familiar. As she wiped down the kitchen counter, her reflection caught in the glossy surface, a woman in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that had seen more than they let on. She traced the faint laugh lines around her mouth, remnants of happier times, and realized she didn't feel broken. Disappointed, yes. Betrayed, undeniably. But shattered? Not even close. She sat at her desk, opening her laptop with a steady hand. The login screen greeted her, a gateway to the life Ryan had underestimated. Her financial spreadsheets, meticulously organized, revealed the truth. Ryan might have drained their joint account, but it was a mere fragment of her assets. Months ago, when the late nights and evasive glances began piling up, Hannah had quietly opened her own account, diverting portions of her income into it. She wasn't naive, she had sensed the shift in Ryan's affections, the growing distance masked by feigned affection and hollow apologies. While he thought he was deceiving her, she was already one step ahead, preparing for a storm she knew would come. Hannah scrolled through emails, finding one from her lawyer, a professional she had discreetly consulted after discovering Ryan's first questionable expense hidden among credit card statements. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. The late dinners charged to their joint account, the unexplained hotel stays, the sudden interest in luxury items he never mentioned to her. She had documented everything, not out of spite but from a place of quiet foresight. Now, as she drafted an email to her lawyer, attaching the infamous note and a summary of financial discrepancies, she felt a sense of control. Ryan believed he'd pulled the ultimate escape, but the real game was just beginning, and Hannah was playing by her own rules. While Ryan probably imagined her drowning in debt and desperation, Hannah's reality was far different. She logged into her personal savings account, watching the numbers flicker to life on the screen. It was more than enough, not just to survive but to thrive. Years of disciplined saving, investment portfolios carefully managed, and her flourishing architectural career had built a fortress Ryan never knew existed. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, contemplating the irony. His arrogance had been his blindfold, making him believe she was financially dependent, clinging to the life they had built together. In truth, the life was hers, he had simply been a guest overstaying his welcome. As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Hannah pulled out a leather-bound journal. She flipped through the pages, each filled with sketches of buildings she dreamed of designing, quotes that inspired her, and notes from pivotal moments in her life. She added a new entry, the day Ryan left. The day I reclaimed my freedom. There was no bitterness in the words, only a sense of closure, a chapter ending so another could begin. She made a list, practical steps, legal actions, financial adjustments. It wasn't driven by emotion but by strategy. Freeze joint accounts, secure property deeds, initiate divorce proceedings, and, most importantly, ensure Ryan couldn't worm his way back into any part of her life. She wasn't interested in revenge, she was interested in resolution. As she closed the journal, a sense of peace settled over her. The storm had come and gone, and she was still standing, stronger than before, anchored not by a failing marriage but by her own resilience. Looking back, the red flags were clear, scattered across the timeline of their marriage like breadcrumbs she'd ignored. The late nights at the office that never aligned with his paychecks, the sudden interest in fitness and expensive colognes, the passwords he changed under the guise of privacy. At first, she rationalized it, stress at work, midlife crisis, harmless secrets. But beneath the surface, doubt had taken root, growing quietly until it was impossible to ignore. She remembered finding the crumpled receipt from an upscale restaurant tucked into the pocket of his jeans, dated the same night he claimed to be working late. It wasn't just dinner, it was betrayal, hidden in plain sight. Their marriage had been built on routines, Sunday brunches, evening walks, shared playlists. But as she replayed those moments in her mind, they felt staged, like a play where she'd memorized her lines while Ryan improvised his. The man she married wasn't the man who left that note. Or maybe he was, and she'd just been too in love to see it. Either way, the realization didn't sting as much as she expected. It was liberating, peeling back the layers of pretense to reveal the truth. She had outgrown the version of herself that needed him. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Hannah stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. Each illuminated window told a story, of lives intertwined, of promises made and broken, of people finding their way. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't even sad. She was ready. Ready to turn the page, to write a new chapter where she wasn't defined by someone else's choices but by her own strength. And as she closed the blinds, she knew one thing for certain: Ryan's departure wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. The next morning arrived with the soft buzz of Hannah's phone vibrating against the nightstand. The screen displayed a familiar name, Margot Ellis, her lawyer. Hannah answered without hesitation, her voice calm and steady. Margot's tone was brisk but reassuring. "Hannah, I've reviewed the documents you sent. We're in an excellent position." There was a quiet satisfaction in her voice, the kind that comes from knowing you're holding all the right cards. Hannah listened intently as Margot outlined the next steps: freezing joint assets, filing for divorce, and preparing to serve Ryan with legal papers. It was methodical, clinical even, but beneath it all was a current of quiet vindication. Margot's confidence was contagious, and as they discussed legal strategies, Hannah felt a surge of empowerment. She wasn't the victim in this narrative, she was the architect of her own future, meticulously drafting the blueprint of her next chapter. "Let him think he's won," Margot advised, a sly edge to her voice. "The element of surprise works in our favor." Hannah agreed, her mind already visualizing Ryan's smug face crumbling under the weight of reality when he realized his carefully crafted escape plan was nothing more than an illusion. After ending the call, Hannah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't navigating this alone, she had allies, strategies, and most importantly, the upper hand. She dressed for work with deliberate precision, her outfit a subtle armor against the chaos Ryan had tried to unleash. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she smiled, not because everything was okay, but because she knew it soon would be. The pieces were in motion, and Ryan had no idea the game he'd started was one she intended to win. While Hannah meticulously laid out her legal strategies, Ryan basked in the sun-soaked luxury of an exclusive beachfront resort thousands of miles away. The salty breeze ruffled his freshly styled hair as he lounged poolside, a smug grin plastered across his face. His new girlfriend, Vanessa, a woman nearly a decade younger with an affinity for designer sunglasses and shallow conversations, laughed at one of his exaggerated stories about corporate triumphs. Ryan relished the illusion he had crafted, a man who had outsmarted his wife, freed himself from the dead weight of marriage, and now reaped the rewards of his so-called bravery. He checked his phone occasionally, expecting desperate messages from Hannah, pleas for explanations, or angry demands for answers. But there was nothing. The silence didn't bother him at first. In fact, he found it amusing, convinced it was her way of sulking in defeat. But as the days slipped by, Ryan began to grow uneasy. The smug satisfaction started to wear thin, replaced by the subtle itch of paranoia. He dismissed it as residual guilt, though, in truth, guilt was a foreign concept to him. His confidence remained inflated, anchored by the belief that he had full control of the situation. Vanessa's carefree laughter became background noise, lost amidst the quiet unease brewing beneath Ryan's composed facade. He continued to spend recklessly, swiping their now-drained joint credit card for overpriced dinners and spontaneous shopping sprees, oblivious to the ticking time bomb that was his financial reality. In his mind, Hannah was nothing more than an afterthought, a discarded chapter in the thrilling novel of his new life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting orange and pink streaks across the sky, Ryan found himself alone on the hotel balcony. Vanessa had gone to the spa, leaving him with his thoughts and a glass of expensive whiskey. He stared at his phone, annoyed at the persistent absence of any message from Hannah. It was supposed to be different. He had expected tears, dramatic confrontations, and maybe even desperate attempts to win him back. Instead, there was nothing but silence. That silence gnawed at him, burrowing into the corners of his mind, planting seeds of doubt he refused to water. Little did he know, Hannah's silence wasn't an absence of action, it was the calm before a storm he couldn't even see coming. The illusion of control shattered on an otherwise ordinary morning when Ryan and Vanessa arrived at an upscale boutique to indulge in another of their impulsive shopping sprees. The boutique, known for catering to the city's elite, welcomed them with soft jazz and the faint aroma of luxury perfumes. Ryan selected items without glancing at the price tags, handing his platinum credit card to the cashier with the same smugness that had become second nature. But instead of the expected polite smile and swift transaction, the cashier's expression shifted to polite discomfort as she softly cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, sir, but your card has been declined." The words hit Ryan like a slap. He chuckled awkwardly, dismissing it as a technical glitch. "Try it again," he insisted, sliding the card forward. The same result, a quiet beep, followed by the cashier's apologetic gaze. Annoyed, Ryan pulled out another card, and then another, each meeting the same humiliating fate. Vanessa's amusement faded quickly, her perfectly arched brows furrowing in confusion. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience rather than concern. Ryan forced a strained smile, assuring her it was just a bank error, perhaps a flag due to excessive spending or travel activity. But inside, panic began to bloom. He fumbled with his phone, attempting to log into his banking app, only to be met with error messages and security alerts. The cheerful ambience of the boutique now felt suffocating, the judgmental stares of other customers like daggers. Humiliated, Ryan mumbled something about handling it later, dragging Vanessa out of the store with promises of fixing the issue. His mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize the situation. Back in their luxury suite, Ryan's frustration boiled over. He dialed the bank's customer service, his voice sharp and demanding. But as the representative explained that certain accounts had been frozen due to legal proceedings initiated by his wife, the blood drained from his face. "Legal proceedings?" he repeated, disbelief dripping from his tone. The representative's voice remained professional, unaffected by his growing agitation. "Yes, sir. There's also a notice regarding suspected financial misconduct related to joint accounts." Ryan's mind spun. This wasn't part of his plan. Hannah wasn't supposed to fight back. She was supposed to be heartbroken, paralyzed by his betrayal, not orchestrating legal moves that dismantled his carefully constructed facade. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had underestimated her. Badly. The days that followed were a downward spiral Ryan couldn't control. Every attempt to access his finances was met with locked accounts, frozen assets, and polite yet firm explanations from bank representatives citing legal holds. Vanessa's patience wore thin quickly. The glamorous life she'd signed up for was crumbling, replaced by tense arguments and Ryan's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. One evening, after yet another futile call with the bank, Ryan returned to their suite to find Vanessa packing her designer bags with methodical precision. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. Vanessa didn't bother with theatrics. She zipped her suitcase smoothly and looked him straight in the eye. "I didn't sign up for this mess, Ryan. I thought you had your life together, not whatever this is." Her words stung more than Ryan cared to admit. He tried to salvage his pride, spitting out weak excuses about temporary setbacks and plans to fix everything. But Vanessa was already done. She left without a backward glance, leaving Ryan alone in a suite he couldn't afford, surrounded by luxury items he technically didn't own. His arrogance, once his armor, now felt like a fragile shell cracking under the weight of reality. Desperation gnawed at him, a foreign feeling for someone who always believed he was 2 steps ahead. The life he'd built on lies and stolen money was collapsing, and the worst part was knowing that Hannah was the architect of his downfall. Late that night, Ryan sat in the dim glow of the suite's bedside lamp, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over Hannah's number, a mixture of rage and reluctant admiration swirling within him. He couldn't understand how she had turned the tables so effortlessly. She was supposed to be the fragile one, the one who needed him. But she wasn't. She was the one who had prepared for the storm, while he was the fool who never saw it coming. The irony was bitter, and as he finally sent a message, angry, accusatory, dripping with the remnants of his bruised ego, he knew deep down that she wouldn't respond. Because Hannah had already moved on to the next phase of her plan, and Ryan was nothing more than a footnote in the story she was writing. Ryan's unraveling wasn't confined to the privacy of hotel rooms and failed transactions. The fallout soon spilled into the professional world he had once navigated with ease. Returning home, now stripped of luxury and companionship, he attempted to salvage what remained of his career. But corporate circles were smaller than he'd thought, and news traveled fast, especially when tied to legal scandals and financial misconduct. His former employer, initially sympathetic to his personal issues, grew cold once the legal documents arrived, painting a clear picture of deceit and unethical behavior. The company couldn't risk its reputation. Within days, Ryan was summoned to a formal meeting, where the sterile boardroom felt more like a courtroom. His confident demeanor faltered under the weight of thinly veiled disappointment from colleagues he once believed admired him. The termination was swift and merciless. No second chances, no graceful exits. His professional identity crumbled alongside his personal facade. The job that had once been his badge of honor was now a ghost, leaving him to face the harsh reality of unemployment with a tarnished reputation. Word spread beyond the office, mutual friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives whispered about the man who had it all and lost everything. The humiliation was suffocating, far more potent than any confrontation with Hannah could have been. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was louder than any argument, her absence more powerful than his presence had ever been. Ryan found himself isolated, both socially and emotionally. The friends who once eagerly joined him for drinks now ignored his calls. His lavish apartment, once a symbol of success, felt like an empty shell echoing his failures. As he sat in the quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a life built on arrogance and lies, he couldn't escape the undeniable truth: he had orchestrated his own downfall. Hannah hadn't just survived without him, she had thrived. And that realization, more than the financial ruin or public disgrace, was the final blow to his fragile ego. Ryan's return to the city was far from triumphant. His luxury condo, once a symbol of status, now felt like an impersonal cage echoing with memories of a life he no longer controlled. The pristine white walls seemed colder, the minimalist decor now just empty space devoid of meaning. Bills piled up on the sleek granite countertop, reminders of obligations he could no longer afford. His job was gone, his accounts frozen, and the friends who once circled him like moths to a flame had vanished without a trace. The loneliness was suffocating, but what gnawed at him most wasn't the loss of wealth, it was the looming shadow of Hannah's silence. He expected fury, dramatic confrontations, maybe even desperate pleas. Instead, he received nothing. The absence of her rage was more humiliating than any argument because it confirmed one painful truth: she didn't care anymore. In a moment of desperation, Ryan drove to the house they once shared, a modest, charming townhouse tucked away on a quiet street. He half expected Hannah to be there, drowning in heartbreak, maybe even waiting for him to come back. But when he arrived, the lights were on, the garden was well kept, and laughter drifted faintly through the open windows. She was hosting a gathering, surrounded by friends and colleagues, her face glowing with effortless confidence. There was no sign of grief, no trace of the woman he thought he had left in ruins. She looked happy, genuinely happy, as if his absence had been the final puzzle piece to complete her life. Ryan sat in his car across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his ego crumbling with every passing second. The life he thought he had control over was thriving without him. Unable to contain the bitterness, he finally gathered the nerve to confront her. He knocked on the door, his heart racing, prepared for a heated exchange. But when Hannah opened it, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She greeted him with a calm, polite smile, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances rather than the man she once called her husband. "Ryan," she said simply, her voice steady and composed. There was no hatred in her tone, just indifference. It was the worst insult he could imagine. Before he could launch into whatever weak excuses or accusations he had rehearsed, she added, "If this is about the legal matters, you should contact my lawyer. We have nothing to discuss." And with that, she closed the door, leaving him alone on the porch, drowning in the bitter realization that he no longer mattered. After Hannah closed the door, Ryan stood motionless, staring at the grain of the wood as if it held the answers to his unraveling life. The weight of her indifference crushed him more than any argument ever could. He had expected anger, perhaps even a tearful confrontation that would validate his importance in her life. Instead, she dismissed him like an afterthought, an insignificant footnote in the story of her newfound freedom. Defeated, he stumbled back to his car, his mind spiraling with memories twisted by regret. Every smug decision, every cruel word he had flung at her with careless arrogance now echoed back, not as triumphs, but as markers of his own downfall. Days later, Ryan received the final blow, a formal letter from Hannah's lawyer. It detailed the complete severance of any remaining ties, along with documentation proving that the house he believed was theirs had always been solely in her name. The car he drove? Leased under her business account, now repossessed. Even the savings he thought he had stolen were nothing more than surface-level funds she had left deliberately untouched to maintain his illusion of control. His delusions of power crumbled, leaving behind the stark reality of a man who had been outmaneuvered at every turn. The documents outlined his financial liabilities, the fraud investigations he now faced, and a curt reminder that all communication should be directed to her legal team. Hannah's signature at the bottom wasn't just a formality, it was a symbol of his absolute defeat. Ryan stared at the letter, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He had underestimated her in every possible way, blinded by his own arrogance. The woman he thought was weak had been the mastermind all along, orchestrating his downfall with precision and grace. His mind replayed every moment of condescension, every dismissive laugh, every insult disguised as honest feedback. None of it mattered now. Hannah had won, not just the legal battle, but the war he never realized she was fighting. And the worst part? She didn't even need to lift a finger to crush him. She simply let him destroy himself. In the quiet solitude of his nearly empty apartment, Ryan had no choice but to face the man he had become. The once lavish space, stripped of its expensive furniture and pretentious artwork, mirrored his own hollow existence. The silence was deafening, filled only with the echoes of his own failures. He stared at his reflection in the dusty mirror, no longer the confident, charismatic man who once believed he controlled every room he entered. What stared back was a man aged beyond his years, worn down by his own choices. The realization hit him with brutal clarity: his downfall wasn't Hannah's doing. She had simply exposed the cracks he had spent years ignoring. Meanwhile, Hannah thrived in ways Ryan could never have predicted. She expanded her architecture firm, took on prestigious projects, and surrounded herself with people who genuinely valued her. The woman he once belittled had become a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring others who had faced betrayal and found strength in its aftermath. She didn't just survive, she flourished. Not out of spite, but because she had always possessed the strength he failed to see. Her life was no longer defined by the shadow of their failed marriage. It was vibrant, full of purpose, and untouched by the bitterness that consumed Ryan. As Ryan sat alone, flipping through old photos of a life that felt like someone else's, he realized the true cost of his actions. It wasn't the money, the job, or the reputation. It was losing the chance to be part of Hannah's journey, to witness the remarkable woman she had become. And as he stared at the final photo, one of their wedding day, where both wore smiles that no longer held meaning, he finally understood. He had been nothing more than a chapter in her story, one she had long since finished reading. For Hannah, life continued with the quiet grace of someone who had made peace with the past. She no longer carried the weight of Ryan's betrayal. Instead, she walked lighter, her steps filled with purpose and confidence. Her mornings began with coffee brewed exactly how she liked it, in the sun-drenched kitchen of her own home, a home untouched by the ghosts of her former life. She filled her days with projects that challenged her, friends who supported her, and moments of genuine joy. The scars Ryan left were not hidden, but they were no longer sources of pain. They were reminders of battles fought and won. She often thought about the note he had left, tucked away in a drawer now, not as a keepsake of heartbreak, but as a testament to her resilience. She had responded to his cruelty not with vengeance, but with quiet strength. She had built a life where his absence was not a void, but a space filled with growth and self-discovery. Her success wasn't defined by what she had gained after him, but by what she had reclaimed for herself. She was more than the woman he had underestimated, she was the architect of her own destiny, and her life was a masterpiece he could never touch. Ryan, on the other hand, faded into the background of his own story. A man defined by mistakes, living in the shadow of what could have been. He often wondered if Hannah ever thought about him, but deep down, he knew the answer. She didn't. Because her life was full, her heart unburdened, and her future bright. And that, more than any legal victory or financial success, was the ultimate triumph. Ryan's days blended into one another, marked only by the faint ticking of an old clock in his barren apartment. He had sold off most of his belongings to cover legal fees and mounting debts, but no amount of money could buy back what he truly lost. The walls, once adorned with expensive artwork, now stood bare, mirroring the hollowness in his life. He'd scroll aimlessly through his phone, pausing on old photos of vacations with Hannah, parties where he played the charming husband, oblivious to the slow erosion of his own integrity. Each image was a ghost, haunting him with reminders of a life he couldn't reclaim. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional buzz of his phone, never from Hannah, never from friends, just automated payment reminders he couldn't afford to answer. His attempts to find work were met with polite rejections, thinly veiled under corporate language about fit and current circumstances. His reputation had spread like wildfire, blacklisting him in professional circles where his name once carried weight. Even former colleagues who had laughed at his jokes and admired his bravado now avoided eye contact when passing him on the street. The humiliation was sharp, but it was the loneliness that truly gnawed at him. There was no one to call, no one to confide in. Vanessa had been quick to leave, and the friends he thought were loyal had evaporated with his status. Ryan had built his life on superficial charm and material success, and now, stripped of both, he faced the raw truth: he was nothing without the illusions he'd crafted. One night, staring at the flickering streetlights outside his window, Ryan thought about the last words Hannah had spoken to him. "We have nothing to discuss." Those 5 words echoed louder than any argument could have. They weren't filled with anger, they were filled with indifference. She had moved on, not because she needed to prove anything, but because he simply didn't matter anymore. That was the deepest cut of all. Ryan realized he had never truly seen Hannah, not as a partner, not as a person. He had underestimated her strength, mistaking her kindness for weakness. And now, in the emptiness of his own making, he finally understood the true cost of his arrogance. It wasn't the money, the house, or the job. It was the absence of her. While Ryan sank deeper into his solitude, Hannah's life unfolded with quiet grace and steady growth. Her architecture firm flourished, gaining recognition for innovative designs that blended sustainability with elegance. Clients admired not just her talent, but her unwavering professionalism, a reflection of the resilience she had honed through personal trials. The confidence she carried wasn't loud or performative, it was rooted in the simple truth that she had survived the storm and emerged stronger. Her office, once a modest space tucked into a shared building, now occupied an entire floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed her work in natural light. She often stood there, coffee in hand, looking out at the city that had been both witness and backdrop to her transformation. Her personal life blossomed alongside her career. She surrounded herself with friends who uplifted her, people who valued authenticity over appearances. There were weekends filled with laughter, spontaneous road trips, and quiet evenings spent reading in the cozy apartment she had redesigned to reflect her new chapter. She even found companionship again, not in the desperate search for validation, but in an unexpected connection with someone who admired her strength rather than felt threatened by it. There was no rush, no pressure to define it. For the first time in years, Hannah felt free to be herself, without the weight of someone else's expectations. Occasionally, Ryan crossed her mind, not with bitterness, but with a distant curiosity, like recalling a dream from long ago. She wondered if he had found peace or if he was still trapped by the very walls he had built. But the thought never lingered. She had made peace with the past, understanding that Ryan had been a lesson, not a life sentence. His betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been the catalyst for her rediscovery. She no longer needed closure because she had created it for herself. Her life was full, her heart whole, not because she had found someone new, but because she had found herself. Months later, Hannah attended a networking gala, a sophisticated event filled with industry leaders, potential clients, and ambitious entrepreneurs. She moved through the crowd with ease, her presence marked by an effortless elegance that turned heads without trying. She was engaged in a conversation about an upcoming urban development project when a familiar, albeit unwelcome, face appeared across the room. Ryan. He was thinner, his once meticulously styled hair now unkempt, his tailored suits replaced with something ill-fitting and worn. He lingered near the entrance, clearly out of place, clutching a drink like it was his last anchor in the room. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on her, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. Hannah didn't flinch. She offered a polite, indifferent nod, nothing more. She returned to her conversation, her expression unchanged, as if seeing him was no more significant than passing a stranger on the street. The encounter lasted seconds, but for Ryan, it was an eternity. He had thought, foolishly, that seeing her might trigger something, regret, anger, perhaps even nostalgia. Instead, she looked at him with the same neutrality one reserved for background noise. The realization hit harder than any financial loss. She had truly moved on. She wasn't pretending, wasn't holding back tears behind forced smiles. She was simply unaffected. Ryan left the gala early, drowning in the stark contrast between their lives. He had clung to the belief that she'd always carry some piece of him, some lingering attachment to the past. But her indifference was absolute. She had erased him, not out of malice, but because he no longer mattered. And that was the cruelest truth of all. to be forgotten by someone whose world he once thought revolved around him. Meanwhile, Hannah didn't give the encounter a second thought. She had a life to live, one that had nothing to do with Ryan or the broken echoes of who he used to be. Back in his cramped apartment, Ryan stared at the cracked ceiling, replaying the gala encounter over and over in his mind. Her face haunted him, not because it showed anger or sadness, but because it didn't show anything at all. It was as if he'd never existed in her world. The indifference was unbearable. He realized that losing her wasn't the tragedy, it was never really having her in the way he thought he did. She had been there, yes, but he had never truly seen her, never valued her beyond what she provided for his ego. The woman he married had always been strong, he had just been too blinded by arrogance to notice. His reflection in the dusty mirror was a stranger. The man who once exuded charm and confidence was gone, replaced by someone hollow and weary. He tried to piece together where it all went wrong, but the truth was painfully clear, it had always been wrong. His choices, his selfishness, his inability to see beyond his own needs had carved the path to his downfall. Hannah hadn't destroyed him, he had done that all on his own. The documents she filed, the legal actions she took, were merely the final steps in a journey he had set in motion years ago. For the first time, Ryan felt something foreign, accountability. There was no one left to blame, no narrative to twist in his favor. Just the raw, unfiltered truth of who he was and what he'd lost. And the most painful realization of all was that even if he could go back, even if he could rewrite history, it wouldn't matter. Because Hannah had never needed him. She had always been whole. He had just been a chapter in her story, one she had closed long ago. As days turned into weeks, Ryan found himself imprisoned not by walls, but by the weight of his own regret. The cracked mirror above his bathroom sink became an unwilling confidant, reflecting a face he barely recognized, a man hollowed out by choices he couldn't undo. His once sharp features were dulled by exhaustion, the spark in his eyes extinguished by the realization that the life he had meticulously constructed was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Each morning felt heavier than the last, with no job to rush to, no friends to meet, no purpose to cling to. His phone remained eerily silent, save for occasional calls from debt collectors or legal reminders tied to the financial mess he'd left in his wake. In the quiet moments, Ryan's mind became a relentless projector, replaying scenes from his past with brutal clarity. He remembered the early days with Hannah, the genuine laughter over late-night takeout, the shared dreams scribbled on napkins, the quiet companionship during rainy afternoons. Those memories were bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that his own arrogance had eroded the foundation of what could have been a life filled with meaning. He realized that Hannah had never been the problem, it had always been him, his insatiable need for control, his addiction to validation from people who never truly mattered. And now, stripped of everything superficial, all he had left was the echo of her absence, louder than any argument they'd ever had. One evening, drowning in the haze of cheap whiskey and regret, Ryan stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away in a dusty box, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Flipping through the pages, he lingered on a photo of their wedding day. Hannah's smile was radiant, her eyes filled with hope and trust. His own face stared back with a smugness he now found unbearable. Closing the album, he realized that the man in those photos had been an imposter, hiding behind charm and ambition. For the first time, Ryan didn't just miss Hannah, he mourned the man he could have been, the one he never allowed himself to become. While Ryan grappled with his self-inflicted downfall, Hannah's life continued to unfold like a masterpiece crafted with intention and resilience. Her architecture firm had grown beyond what she once imagined, with projects featured in renowned publications and invitations to speak at industry conferences. But success, for Hannah, wasn't measured by accolades or financial gains. It was woven into the quiet confidence she carried, the ability to walk into any room without shrinking, the freedom to design a life on her own terms. Her days were filled with purpose, surrounded by people who valued her not for what she could give, but for who she was, a woman who had rebuilt her world from the rubble of betrayal. Her apartment reflected this transformation. The space was filled with warmth, sunlight streaming through large windows, shelves lined with books she loved, and art pieces that spoke to her journey. Among them was a small, framed sketch of a bridge she had designed during one of her most challenging projects. It wasn't her most celebrated work, but it symbolized her resilience, the ability to create something strong and beautiful even when everything felt like it was falling apart. That bridge, much like her life, stood as a testament to endurance, connection, and the power of foundations built with care. Hannah rarely thought about Ryan anymore. When she did, it wasn't with anger or sadness. It was more like remembering an old story, one with lessons learned but no lingering attachments. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. Holding on to resentment would have only anchored her to a past she had outgrown. She understood now that Ryan had been a chapter, not the whole book. And in the pages that followed, she had discovered new depths within herself, strength she didn't know she had, joy she thought she'd lost, and a life that was fuller than she ever dreamed possible. Months later, fate orchestrated an unexpected meeting. Hannah was at a local café, tucked into a corner with her laptop, reviewing design plans for an upcoming project. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of conversation created a comforting backdrop. She was immersed in her work when a shadow fell across her table. Looking up, she saw Ryan, disheveled, thinner, his eyes hollow and tired. He hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he had the right to exist in her world anymore. "Hi, Hannah," he said quietly, his voice lacking the arrogant confidence she once knew. Hannah closed her laptop calmly, her expression neutral. "Ryan." She acknowledged him with the same tone one might reserve for an acquaintance, polite but distant. There was no flicker of emotion, no sign of the pain he might have hoped to see. She was simply unaffected. He sat down without an invitation, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around a chipped coffee cup. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice wavering. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't realize." Hannah raised a hand, gently cutting him off. "It's okay, Ryan. You don't need to explain." Her words weren't harsh, but they carried the finality of a door gently closing. She didn't need his apology because she had already healed. His regret, his realization, it wasn't for her benefit. It was his burden to carry. She had moved on, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she had built a life where his absence was just that, an absence, not a loss. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing the truth in her words. He had come seeking closure, perhaps hoping to find a crack in her armor where he could still matter. But there was none. She had outgrown him, and that was the most humbling realization of all. As Hannah gathered her things to leave, she offered him a polite smile, kind, yet distant. "Take care, Ryan," she said softly, then walked away without looking back. And just like that, the chapter was truly closed. Ryan remained seated long after Hannah had left, staring at the empty chair across from him. The finality of her indifference was both devastating and liberating. There were no dramatic words exchanged, no emotional confrontations, just a quiet acknowledgement that their lives had diverged completely. It was the absence of emotion that hurt the most. She didn't hate him. She didn't love him. She simply didn't care. And for the first time, Ryan realized that was the true end, not the day he walked out, not the legal battles, but this very moment, sitting alone in a cafe where even her memory had no place. He left the cafe feeling lighter in a strange way. The burden of what-ifs and imagined scenarios had been replaced by a simple, undeniable truth: there was no going back. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. For the first time, he wasn't clinging to the past, trying to rewrite it or justify it. He was just existing, facing the consequences of his choices without the buffer of denial. Ryan wandered the streets after leaving the cafe, the cool breeze brushing against his face, but the chill he felt came from within. There was no dramatic ending, no closure wrapped in emotional fireworks, just the simple finality of Hannah's indifference. Her words echoed in his mind, not because they were harsh, but because they were empty of anything that tethered him to her anymore. "Take care, Ryan." That was it. No resentment, no lingering affection, just a polite farewell as if he were a stranger she had met in passing. It hit him harder than any confrontation could have. He had always imagined, even in his darkest moments, that there would be some trace of him left in her heart, some scar, some ember of emotion. But there was nothing. She had healed, and he was nothing more than a shadow from her past. For the first time, Ryan didn't try to rationalize or shift the blame. There was no one left to deceive, not even himself. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket: he had been the architect of his own ruin. The job, the reputation, the marriage, they hadn't been stolen from him. He'd squandered them with his arrogance and selfishness. The woman he thought he'd broken had simply rebuilt herself without him, brick by brick, stronger than before. And here he was, lost amidst the remnants of a life he'd treated carelessly, wandering through the city like a ghost haunting places that no longer held meaning. That night, he returned to his apartment, a space that felt colder than ever. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was deafening, filled with echoes of decisions he couldn't take back. He stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, studying the man who stared back. There was no trace of the confident, successful person he used to project. Just a man stripped of his illusions, left with nothing but regret. For the first time, Ryan understood that closure doesn't come from others. It comes from facing the truth without flinching. And the truth was simple: he had lost Hannah long before she ever walked away. Days passed, then weeks. Ryan's routine became painfully monotonous, a cycle of waking up to nothing, avoiding calls he didn't want to answer, and drowning in memories he couldn't escape. But something was different after that encounter with Hannah. Her indifference wasn't just a wound, it was a mirror reflecting what he had refused to see. She had moved on because she had chosen herself. And maybe, for the first time in his life, that's what he needed to do too, not in the superficial way he had lived before, chasing validation through status, money, and relationships, but in the raw, uncomfortable process of facing who he truly was. One morning, without overthinking, he found himself standing outside a small community center. It wasn't planned, just an impulsive turn down a street he rarely walked. A sign in the window read, "Support Group for Personal Growth and Recovery, all welcome." Ryan hesitated at the door, his pride clawing at him to walk away. But pride had been his downfall, hadn't it? So, for the first time in years, he swallowed it. He stepped inside, greeted not by judgment, but by a simple nod from the facilitator, a quiet acknowledgement that he was there, and that was enough. The first meeting was uncomfortable. Ryan didn't speak. He just listened. Stories of loss, betrayal, mistakes, and recovery filled the room. No one pretended to have it all together. There were no facades, no masks to wear. Just raw honesty. It was jarring, but it stirred something in him. These people weren't defined by their pasts. They weren't trapped by their failures. They had found a way to live with them, to grow beyond them. For the first time, Ryan saw a path, not an easy one, not a quick fix, but a path nonetheless. And that night, as he left the meeting, the city felt a little less empty. Ryan began attending the meetings regularly. He still didn't say much at first, but he listened, really listened. The stories mirrored fragments of his own life, even if the details were different. There was a strange comfort in knowing he wasn't alone in his failures, that others had fallen, some even harder than he had, yet they were still standing. Slowly, he started sharing small pieces of his own story, not the curated version he used to tell, but the messy, unfiltered truth. It wasn't easy. Admitting his mistakes out loud felt like peeling away layers of denial he'd wrapped himself in for years. But with each word, the burden grew lighter. Outside the meetings, he made small changes. He stopped avoiding his responsibilities and started addressing the mess he'd left behind. He reached out to former colleagues, not to beg for opportunities, but to apologize for the bridges he'd burned. Some responded with polite indifference, others with genuine acceptance, and some didn't respond at all. But that wasn't the point. The point was showing up, not for them, but for himself. He picked up part-time work doing things he never imagined himself doing, manual labor, odd jobs, anything to stay afloat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And for once, Ryan found a strange sense of pride in that honesty. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the weight of regret felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of clarity, brief flashes where he saw the man he was becoming, not the one he had been. One evening, while walking home from a shift at a local warehouse, he paused by a bridge overlooking the river. The city lights reflected on the water, rippling with movement. He thought of Hannah then, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Her strength had shown him what he needed to find within himself. She had closed the door not out of cruelty, but because he needed to learn how to open his own. And for the first time, Ryan didn't feel lost. He felt like he was finally on his way. While Ryan navigated the slow, painful process of self-discovery, Hannah's life continued to blossom. Her architectural firm had expanded internationally, her designs celebrated for their innovative approach to sustainability and human connection. But success wasn't just in the headlines or accolades, it was in the quiet moments she cherished the most. Mornings spent journaling by her window, evenings filled with meaningful conversations, weekends exploring new cities, not because she was running from anything, but because she was fully present in her life. She had met someone new, but it wasn't a story of sweeping romance or dramatic declarations. It was quiet and steady, built on mutual respect and genuine companionship. There was no pedestal, no chasing or being chased, just two people who valued each other without needing to fill voids. She didn't compare him to Ryan because there was no comparison. That chapter was closed, filed under lessons learned, not wounds left open. She carried no bitterness, only wisdom. One afternoon, while reviewing the final designs for a community center, a project close to her heart, she paused, reflecting on how far she had come. The woman who had once been blindsided by betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who had faced heartbreak, disappointment, and loss, yet chose growth every time. She thought of Ryan occasionally, but not with emotion. Just a distant acknowledgement of someone she used to know. And that was her triumph, not that she had moved on, but that she had flourished. Ryan's growth wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments where the temptation to revert to old habits crept in. But the difference now was his awareness. He recognized the patterns, the triggers, and he faced them instead of running. He continued attending his support group, now a regular voice, sharing insights not from a place of authority, but from experience. His story became one of many, a reminder that people could change, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent efforts. He found purpose in helping others, volunteering at the community center where he had first stumbled upon the support group. It was there, surrounded by people who had also faced their own darkness, that he felt most grounded. He wasn't trying to erase his past anymore. He was learning to live with it, to let it be part of his story without defining him. He even started writing, not for anyone else, but to process his journey, pages filled with reflections, lessons, and hopes. One day, while cleaning out an old box, he found the note he had left for Hannah all those years ago. "I've left you. Good luck surviving without me." Reading it now, the words felt like they had been written by a stranger. He didn't keep the note. He burned it, not out of anger, but as a quiet ritual of closure, not for Hannah, but for himself. Because the truth was, she had survived. Thrived, even. And now, so was he. The flames flickered softly in the small metal tray as Ryan watched the edges of the note curl, blackening into ash. The once cruel words, scribbled with arrogance and entitlement, crumbled quietly, leaving nothing but fragile remnants of a man he no longer was. There was no grand ceremony, no audience to witness the symbolic act, just Ryan, alone in his modest apartment, standing in silence as the last traces of his past mistakes turned to dust. It wasn't about erasing history, it was about acknowledging it without letting it define him. As the final embers faded, he felt an unexpected lightness in his chest, a space cleared, not by forgetting, but by accepting. After extinguishing the ashes, Ryan sat down with a blank notebook, the same one he'd been filling with scattered reflections over the past year. But this time, he didn't write about regret or mistakes. He wrote about growth. About the lessons learned from losing everything he thought mattered, only to discover what truly did. His words weren't polished or profound, but they were honest. "I wasn't the victim of anyone but myself. But every day I choose to be better is a day I reclaim my life." The simple act of writing it down felt like planting a seed, something small but filled with potential. That night, Ryan lay in bed, not haunted by what he'd lost, but grounded in what he'd found. The silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. He thought of Hannah, not with longing or regret, but with gratitude. She had been the catalyst for his reckoning, the mirror that reflected not who he was, but who he had the potential to become. And while he knew their paths would never cross in the way they once did, he silently wished her well, not because he needed her forgiveness, but because he had finally forgiven himself. Meanwhile, Hannah stood at the unveiling of her latest project, a stunning pedestrian bridge that arched gracefully over a river in the heart of the city. The bridge was more than just a structure, it was a symbol of connection, resilience, and the beauty of moving forward. As she addressed the crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her voice carried with quiet confidence, reflecting not just her professional success but her personal growth. She spoke about the importance of bridges, not just the physical ones, but the metaphorical ones we build within ourselves, spanning the gaps between who we were and who we choose to become. As the applause faded and people began crossing the bridge for the first time, Hannah lingered for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal railing. She gazed at the water below, watching the ripples dance in the afternoon sunlight. Life, she realized, was a lot like that river, constantly moving, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing forward. She thought of Ryan briefly, wondering where life had taken him, but there was no emotional weight to the thought. Just a fleeting curiosity about someone who had once been part of her story. Walking across the bridge, she felt the sturdy structure beneath her feet, a testament to her vision and perseverance. But the real bridge was the one she had built within herself, piece by piece, after her life had fallen apart. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong, beautiful, and uniquely hers. And as she reached the other side, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not because life had been easy, but because she had chosen to rise, again and again. Months passed, and life continued its quiet march forward. Ryan found himself thriving in ways he never expected, not with wealth or status, but with simple, honest living. He had taken a job at a local nonprofit, helping others rebuild their lives after personal losses. The work was fulfilling, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because it mattered. For the first time, Ryan's sense of worth wasn't tied to titles or possessions. It was rooted in who he was when no one was watching. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ryan walked through a park on his way home, the leaves crunching beneath his worn but sturdy boots. Across the park, he spotted a familiar figure, Hannah. She was seated on a bench, laughing with a man beside her, their easy connection evident even from a distance. She looked radiant, her face glowing with the contentment of someone who had made peace with her past and embraced her present. Ryan paused for a moment, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't feel the urge to approach her. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he watched for just a moment longer, not with regret, but with respect. She had found her happiness, and so had he, in his own way, on his own path. Turning away, he continued his walk, the cool breeze brushing against his face, carrying with it the bittersweet scent of closure. Their paths had crossed once, left marks on each other's stories, and diverged. And that was okay. Some people are lessons, some are blessings. Hannah had been both. Years later, Ryan sat at a small café, the same one where he'd last spoken to Hannah. The place had changed slightly, with new decor and a younger crowd, but for Ryan, it was a symbol of how life moves on, whether we're ready or not. He sipped his coffee, a journal open in front of him, filled with pages of reflections, lessons, and stories. He wasn't the man he once was. The sharp edges had softened, not dulled by failure, but shaped by growth. Across town, Hannah stood in front of a classroom, guest lecturing at a university about architecture and design. But her lecture wasn't just about buildings, it was about resilience, about how the structures we create reflect the lives we live. She spoke about foundations, not just in architecture, but in relationships, careers, and personal growth. Her students listened intently, drawn not just to her expertise but to her authenticity. Both of them, in different corners of the city, were living lives they never could have imagined. Not perfect lives, but meaningful ones. They hadn't needed each other to find happiness, they had needed to lose each other to discover themselves. And in that loss, they had both found something far more valuable: freedom. The story didn't end with them together. It didn't need to. The real ending was in the lives they built after, in the strength they found within, and in the peace that comes from letting go. Because sometimes, the greatest love story isn't the one you have with another person, it's the one you have with yourself.